Everybody, welcome to the Thursday seminar. It's great to see so many faces in the crowd. I'm going to turn it over to our introducer, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Kei. I'm a fourth-year PhD student here in EEB, and I'm honored here today to introduce Dr. Elliott Sober to you all. Dr. Sober is a well-renowned philosopher in biology, specializing in evolution. His CV is so long, and his achievements are so great that it's difficult for me to even summarize. He finished his PhD at Harvard in 1974. Since then, he has been a faculty member of Department of Philosophy at University of Wisconsin-Madison, while holding other positions as well. And one of those positions was a visiting scientist in the Museum of Zoology here at U of M in 1988. He is now Hans Rickenbach Professor and William F. Willis Research Professor Emeritus at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also William H. Bonsall Visiting Professor in the Humanities at Stanford. He was the president of 3 philosophical associations and also was the chair of History and Philosophy of Science of AAS. He won numerous awards, fellowships, and funding, published hundreds of papers, and more than 10 books. He has been foundational in discussions of levels of selection, phylogenetic theory, and theories of inference. He is well known for the books The Nature of Selection, Evidence and Evolution, and Occam's Razors, the User's Manual, among others. Now, without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Sober on why did Darwin change his mind about sex ratio.
Okay, there's our question. And how do I advance this thing? Here we go. No.
You might have to click on the screen sometimes.
Hmm?
You might have to click on the screen sometimes. That helps.
On the screen? Oh.
With the mouse.
Oh.
Let's see if that does more. Oh, that's not doing good. There we go.
Ah, thanks.
Yep.
Okay, so this is going to be material from this paradoxically titled book that I published some years ago. It's from a chapter in that book. So I'm going to describe the puzzle that Darwin tried to solve in the first edition of The Descent of Man. This book appeared in 1871. That's 12 years later than The Origin of Species appeared in 1859. I hope I did my math right. I'm going to describe some of the sources that Darwin had for his ideas about the evolution of sex ratio. And then the mystery emerges. Darwin retracted his proposed explanation in 1874, the second edition of The Descent of Man, and he does not explain why he retracted. And I'll speculate about 2 reasons that he might have had for doing so. This is a weird thing in Darwin scholarship because Darwin is a historian's dream. He wrote down every thought he ever had. He saved his correspondence to other people. He saved all the letters he got back. He saved his notebooks and his paraphernalia, you name it. And I've looked through the archives in Cambridge University. Other better scholars than I have done the same thing, and there's not a shred of evidence to solve the puzzle. So it's a juicy thing if you're into that sort of thing. So here's just to get started on the puzzle, not the puzzle about why he retracted, but just the problem of explaining sex ratio. It's easy enough to imagine how natural selection can favor fast zebras over slow ones. The faster ones, suppose, are better able to avoid predator lions, so they survive more successfully than the slow ones do. The fast ones have fast offspring, the slow ones have slow offspring, blah, 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 and pretty soon everybody's running fast in the herd. But here's a puzzle that gives you a beginning of a feeling for why sex ratio is a little bit different from this sort of standard, obvious example of how natural selection works. The sex ratio in a population is just the number of males divided by the number of females. This is an artifact of a sexist stage of putting men first, but that's biologists continue to do it that way. Human sex ratio is a little bit more than 50% at birth, and in old age, it's considerably less than 50%, as Darwin will point out to you soon enough. So here's a part of the puzzle. How can natural selection favor parents who have 5 sons and 5 daughters over parents who have 10 sons and 0 daughters, or 0 sons and 10 daughters? If success according to natural selection is just having babies, they're all having 10 kids. What difference does it make? That's the beginning of the puzzle that Darwin wants to solve. And his goal is to have a theory about how natural selection will govern the evolution of the sex ratio, which will explain the proportion of the sexes not at birth, which is 51%, and not at old age, where it's less than 51%, but at maturity, where maybe it's 50%. His data included some data that I'll get to in a minute, but he has lots of information about species in which the sex ratio is not even. He says the males of some few mammals, of many birds, and of fish and insects considerably exceed in number the females. 8 groups of insects in which females outnumber males. And the pattern I described a minute ago, human populations are consistently male biased at birth. In old age, the females in all old settled countries where statistical records have been kept are found to preponderate considerably over the males. So he sees from his data that there's not one problem about sex ratio. There is at least a couple, because there's the near even sex ratio for human beings, but there's female biased sex ratios in other species, male bias in others. But he's going to narrow his focus here. He says an excess in the number of one sex over the other might be of great advantage to the species, as with the sterile females of social insects, or with those animals in which more than one male is requisite to fertilize the female. And then he says, strangely, this uneven sex ratio might have been acquired through natural selection, but from their rarity, they need not here be further considered. Well, he mentions a lot of species in which it does happen, so why are we shelving this? And secondly, as you'll see in a few minutes, he actually has an answer to why some species will have sex ratios that are not even. Okay, so here's the theory. Let's now take the case of a species producing in excess of one sex, we will say of males, these being superfluous and useless or nearly useless. Could the sexes be equalized through natural selection? We may feel sure that certain pairs would produce a somewhat less excess of males over females than other pairs. The former would necessarily produce more females and would therefore be more productive. On the doctrine of chances, a greater number of the offspring of the more productive pairs would survive, and these would inherit a tendency to procreate fewer males and more females. Thus, a tendency towards the equalization of the sexes would be brought about. Basically, if there are an excess of males, having daughters is a better strategy. If the reverse is true, and then there are an excess of females, then having sons is a better strategy. What's the best strategy is to produce the rare sex. That's the basic idea he had. What does he mean by excess here? He says if males are in the majority, some of them are in excess. If females are in the majority, some of them are in excess. And I suggest to you what Darwin is doing is he's assuming that the species is monogamous. Now, a question that Darwin considers in other contexts is whether selection occurs at the level of individual organisms in a population, or involves groups of organisms competing with other groups of organisms in a different population, in the same population. The first is called individual selection now. The second is called group selection now. Now, with monogamy, an even sex ratio in a group of size n makes the group more productive than a biased sex ratio in a group of size n. But that's not what Darwin says. He says that some parental pairs will be more productive than others in the same group. So he's giving a theory of sex ratio evolution that involves individual selection. Now here's where Darwin actually shows you how his theory can apply to the explanation of uneven sex ratios. He says that the argument also applies to polygynous species. That's several females with one male. If we assume the excess of females to be inordinately great, for example, if each mating group contains one male and 3 females, and the population sex ratio is 90% female, Darwin's saying selection will reduce the population to 75% female, in which case nobody is in excess. Where did Darwin get this idea? Out of the blue? Well, not at all. A very influential paper from 1710 by John Arbuthnot, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, was called An Argument for Divine Providence, taken from the constant regularity observed in the birth of both sexes, on the exact balance that is maintained between the numbers of men and women, that the species may never fail nor perish. Arbuthnot says that the external accidents to which males are subject, who must seek their food with danger, do make a great havoc of them. Thus, this loss exceeds far that of the other sex occasioned by diseases incident to it. To repair that loss, provident nature, by the disposal of its wise creator, brings forth more males than females. So here's a creationist explanation of sex ratio. God wants every man to have a wife and every woman to have a husband. How's he going to do this? Well, he's going to create a male bias at birth because boys are going to die more frequently than girls. So by the time the generation reaches maturity, it's 50-50. That's God's intent, and that's why the sex ratio is what it is for human beings. I mean, we're used to now thinking about creationism as like a different planet from evolutionary biology. But you'll see how much Darwin depends on this idea in a minute. Arbuthnot also says polygamy is contrary to the law of nature and justice and to the propagation of the human race. For where males and females are in equal number, if one man takes 20 wives, 19 men must live in celibacy, which is repugnant to the design of nature. Nor is it probable that 20 women will be so well impregnated by one man as by 20. So polygamy is wrong. Now, fortunately, we know one thing about Darwin in connection with his problem is that he didn't know anything about Arbuthnot's important paper. By the way, this paper is often cited as the first significance test in the history of statistics. The argument he gave. I forgot to tell you what he did. Arbuthnot gathered christening records covering 70 years in London and all these little churches, and he discovered with a ton of data that in each of those 70 years, there's slightly more boys than girls born. And what he does is he considers the possibility that the probability of a boy or the probability of a girl are equal, 50-50, and shows that if that hypothesis is true, the observed female bias over 70 years is 1 over a gazillion. So low that we can reject the null hypothesis, significance test, that the sex ratio is 50-50. The probability of a male is 50-50 with females. So that's what Arbuthnot says. Darwin, we know, never read this because there's no record of it, although he does record the fact that he once looked at something that Arbuthnot wrote about the collection of antique coins. That's it. What he did read was William Paley's The Principle of Moral and Political Philosophy. He read this while he was a student in Cambridge. And Paley, you'll remember, is famous for the watchmaker, the watch argument. You find the watch on the heath, and it's very well designed for telling time. How do you explain that? Is it by chance that the watch was assembled? That's stupid. And it must be intelligent design. Paley did not make up that argument, like is true here. He was reporting what he had read elsewhere. He had read Arbuthnot, and he just repeats Arbuthnot's argument. Paley says, the equality in the number of males and females born into the world intimates the intention of God that one woman should be assigned to one man. For if to one man be allowed an exclusive right to 5 or more women, 4 or more men must be deprived of an exclusive possession of any, which could never be the order intended. And then what about polygamy and monogamy? God, of course, Paley follows Arbuthnot. God wants us to be monogamous. And here's Paley's argument for why we know that. Well, if God had intended us to be polygamous, he would not have started the human race with one male and one female, especially as by giving Adam more wives than one, the multiplication of the human race would have proceeded with a quicker progress. And there's a cool footnote that Paley has to the word equality of the two sexes, equal frequencies. He says, the equality in the number of males and females born into the world intimates the intention of God that one woman should be assigned to one man. For if to one man be allowed an exclusive right to 5 or more women, 4 or more men must be deprived of the exclusive possession of any, which could never be the order intended. And to the 50-50 footnote, he says the equality is not exact. It's not exactly 50-50. We know that it's about 51%. The number of male infants exceeds that of females in the proportion of 19 to 18 or thereabouts, which excess provides for the greater consumption of males by war, seafaring, and other dangerous or unhealthy occupations. Well, Darwin was not only how do we know he read that? Well, when he took his exams, his final exams at Cambridge, he was examined on Paley's book. So probably he read it. And moreover, Darwin lived in Paley's rooms in Christ College. So he knew all about Paley walking in the door. Paley was a very famous author in those days. So the idea that monogamy, uneven sex ratio at birth, even sex ratio at maturity, and unequal mortality of the two sexes are connected was something Paley was aware of way before he even developed his theory of evolution. He learned this by reading Paley, who was channeling Arbuthnot. And what Darwin did was really quite a simple thing. He just replaced God's wanting us to be monogamous with the fact of monogamy. And God's arranging the sex ratios. He substituted natural selection. It's just a substitution instance of Arbuthnot's argument. And here's what he says 3 years later, Darwin. I firmly thought that when a tendency to produce the two sexes in equal numbers was advantageous to the species, it would follow from natural selection. But I now see that the whole problem is so intricate that it is safer to leave its solution to the future. And like I mentioned at the start, it kills us, Darwin aficionados, or people interested in Darwin, that he doesn't tell you what's wrong with the argument. He just says it's flawed. And it's too hard to explain why, or something. So why did he retract? Well, let's start with the possibility that there was some data that Darwin actually had available to him, and maybe this is part of the answer. He says that although orangutans are monogamous, gorillas, chimps, and baboons are not, and the same holds of many human beings, present and past. He says, judging from the social habits of man as he now exists, and from most savages being polygamists, the most probable view is that primeval man aboriginally lived in small communities, each with as many wives as he could support and obtain, or he may have lived with several wives by himself, like the gorilla. So he thought, well, maybe that's what made him back away from the explanation, which wasn't just about human beings, but it was about that too. Well, do those observations that he reports here, does that just flat out refute Darwin's theory? For example, does the theory say that all monogamous species evolve an even sex ratio and all polygynous species evolve female biased sex ratios? Well, if that's what the theory says, yes, the observation they're all counterexamples. They all refute that. Well, maybe the theory says something a little more modest, that most monogamous species evolve even sex ratios and most polygynous species evolve female biased sex ratios. I think this is a better interpretation of what Darwin is saying. He's saying that the probability of an even sex ratio evolving, if you have monogamy, is greater than the probability of an even sex ratio evolving if you have polygyny. And similarly, the probability of a female biased sex ratio evolving, if there's polygyny, is greater than the probability of a female sex ratio evolving if there's monogamy. And the basic idea is, I think that Darwin's theory is saying basically what we might say by parallel, that mating scheme is related to sex ratio as smoking is related to lung cancer. The mating scheme promotes one form of pair formation over another, one sex ratio over another. And of course, that doesn't, if that's what the theory is really saying, finding a few polygynous species that have an even sex ratio doesn't refute this idea. And this is my preferred understanding of what Darwin is saying, that whether the species is monogamous or polygynous, that will incline the lineage to evolve towards the one sex ratio or the other, where incline is to be understood as a kind of probabilistic umphing, raising the probability of. Did Darwin doubt his model because of phylogenetic considerations? Maybe the fact that some polygynous species have even sex ratios was not what made Darwin doubt his theory. Maybe Darwin suspected that even sex ratio evolved before monogamy. And here I'm making up a story. He doesn't say this, but I think it's a plausible story of what he was doing. And I'm going to talk about an example now that has nothing to do with sex ratio. This is from The Origin of Species, where Darwin is talking about the fact that young mammals have skull sutures. Why do they have that? He says the sutures in the skulls of young mammals have been advanced as a beautiful adaptation for aiding parturition. That means live birth. And no doubt they facilitate or may be indispensable for this act. But as sutures occur in the skulls of young birds and reptiles, which have only to escape from a broken egg, we may infer that this structure has arisen from the laws of growth and has been taken advantage of in the parturition of the higher animals. Well, here's a puzzle about this explanation where Darwin is actually criticizing the hypothesis that skull sutures in mammals evolved to facilitate live birth. He's talking about mammals, and then all of a sudden he's talking about birds and reptiles. What's that got to do with mammals? It seems like it's just, it's a hiccup, I think what he's doing is he's exploiting the fact, as he sees it, that mammals, birds, and reptiles have a common ancestor. And this is where the phylogenetic consideration comes into the argument, as I think. So here's a tree that, I'm really making this up. I'm thinking that Darwin has got this tree in his mind, a phylogenetic tree in which mammals and birds are more closely related to each other than either is to reptiles. For those of you who aren't familiar with phylogenetic trees, I don't know if there's anybody like that in the audience. At the top is now, as you go down the page, you're going back in time. And when lineages connect in the past, you're finding a common ancestor. So you see the more recent common ancestor that's shared only by mammals and birds, and the more ancient ancestor that all three of these groups have. So I'm imagining Darwin is thinking about this phylogenetic tree, and then he's making an inference about what the ancestral character states were in the two interior nodes in this tree, not at the least, but there below. And he's thinking that since, let's talk about the first one, the one that's the more recent one that unites only mammals and birds. He's thinking that since they both have sutures, their most recent common ancestor has a suture. When we go to the one down at the bottom of the page, Darwin's thinking that ancient ancestor of all three had sutures and did not have live birth. Well, why is he making this inference about the characteristics of these ancestors, which you can't observe, from what he can observe, namely the organisms alive at the top of the tree? He's using parsimony. He's thinking about what assignment of character states to ancestors would require the fewest number of change in character states as you move up in the tree. By the red assignments you see there, there's only one change in character state that needs to be made. The sutures don't have to change at all. They all just zip up there, 0 changes, and there you see mammals, birds, and reptiles all having sutures. No live birth goes to no live birth, goes to no live birth, no changes there, but you got to change one time on this branch to get live births in mammals. That's the most parsimonious assignment of character states to ancestors. Any other assignment would require more changes. There's also a probabilistic rationale for this idea, based on the idea that ancestors and descendants are correlated. I'm not going to say that that was Darwin's idea, though maybe he thought so. So maybe Darwin used chronological reasoning about sex ratio. Oh, hold on. I didn't give you the punchline here. So that's the history. Notice that sutures were around way before live birth evolved. So it's not like the organism is doing, the species is doing live birth, and then sutures evolved to make it easier to have live birth. No, that's got the chronological order exactly backwards. The history is sutures are around from way back when, and then live birth is a Johnny-come-lately. So it's a chronological order argument that he's making. In this example, I think this is pretty clear that this is in the neighborhood of what he's doing. Maybe he used chronological reasoning about sex ratio and monogamy. So here you have, let's suppose that he says that human beings are sometimes monogamous and sometimes polygynous. I have two groups here. These are both human beings. And then you have some other guys, other species out here. And he wants to know what characteristics the ancestors in this tree have. And the most parsimonious assignment here is to have even sex ratios all the way up, and polygyny up to here, and then a single change occurs in this branch. And what he will then say is just what he says about the skull sutures, namely, even sex ratios were available long before monogamy ever occurred. So it's wrong, it's exactly backwards to say that the even sex ratio evolved because there was monogamy. Chronological order is wrong here. So that's my suggestion for what Darwin had going on in his head. But now, why didn't he say that, you know? So puzzling. There's a second problem with Darwin's reasoning here, a very different problem, which I think was first identified by a German biologist that very few people remember anymore, named Carl Dusing, who invented this theory of sex ratio evolution that I'll now describe. Evolutionary biologists, if they know anything about the history about sex ratio evolution theory, think that this is Fisher's argument. Well, it is what Fisher describes in the 1930 book, but he got it from Dusing without footnote, just like Paley did not footnote Arbuthnot. Okay, so you have 3 generations in a population: the parents, their offspring, who have M males and F females, and then in the 3rd generation there are N individuals. And of course, from that it follows that the average male in generation 2 has N over M offspring in generation 3, and the average female in generation 2 has N over F offsprings in generation 3. So you see here that what mix of sons and daughters a parent should have in generation 1. Let me read the slide. What mix of sons and daughters should a parent in generation 1 produce to maximize her number of grand offspring in generation 3? And the answer is that the best strategy is to produce only members of the minority sex. Because just think about one of the examples, like the first one. If there are more males than females in generation 2, then males will have fewer, the average male will have fewer offspring than the average female. Selection for the minorities, producing solely the minority sex. And Dusing, like Darwin might have said, an equilibration process then occurs, and the sex ratio evolves to 50-50, where a parent's expected number of grand offspring isn't affected by its number, as in the number of males and females, sons and daughters it produces. So that's Dusing's argument, familiar now because of Fisher. And Dusing has a criticism of Darwin in this paper. Here's a fact about Dusing's argument. It doesn't matter whether there's monogamy or polygyny in this example. The only thing that matters here is that every offspring has one mother and one father. So the mating scheme is actually irrelevant here. Now I get to the point that Dusing makes. When Darwin talks about excess, that males will be in excess, some males will be in excess if there's a male bias sex ratio, some females will be in excess if there's a female bias sex ratio. Darwin is focusing on the worst thing that can happen. He's just thinking about the males that won't have offspring, or in the case of females being in the majority, of the females who won't have offspring. What Dusing emphasizes, and this is carried forward to the present, I think, in evolutionary biology, is what you've got to do in thinking about this problem is consider all the males and all the females in generation 2 and consider the average productivity of each sex. That's what we did back here. N over M, that's the average for males. N over F, that's the average for females. And the point is that it's the average fitness of a strategy that matters in evolution by natural selection. Focusing on the worst case is like looking in the wrong places. It's the average that matters. So this is another criticism of Darwin's theory. There's a precedent for Darwin having this idea that it's the average effect of a trait that really is the relevant thing to think about in deciding how it's going to evolve by natural selection, not looking at the worst thing that could happen. And it comes up here again in The Origin of Species when Darwin is talking about barbed stingers. He asks, can we consider the sting of the wasp or the bee as perfect, which when used against many attacking animals cannot be withdrawn, owing to the backward serratures of the barb, and so inevitably causes the death of the insect by tearing out its viscera? He says, we can perhaps understand how it is that the use of the sting should so often cause the insect's own death, if on the whole the power of stinging be useful to the community. Here we have group selection. It's good for the hive or the nest. He says it can be, if on the whole the power of stinging be useful to the community, it will fulfill the requirements of natural selection, though it may cause the death of some few members. So he's saying, don't worry about the worst thing that could happen to you if you have a barbed stinger. Think about the average outcome for an organism with a barbed stinger, many of whom don't sting bears. So he is sensitive, I think, to this idea that the worst thing that happened is not the crucial thing, it's the average that's there. So let me summarize what I've just been telling you. Darwin was influenced by Paley's creationist theory, which Paley got from Arbuthnot. And Paley had a model of sex ratio evolution, but he abandoned it. He doesn't say why he retracted. And here are the two possibilities, I think, that are sensible as explanations. Maybe he was influenced by phylogenetic considerations, and that chronological order argument was what he had going on in his head. On the other hand, Dusing uncovered a conceptual flaw in Darwin's argument, the flaw being, don't worry about the worst case scenario. Don't worry about the males that are in excess. Worry about the average male, and so on. And maybe Darwin had that idea too, and I think he did have something like that idea when he talked about barbed stingers. So thanks.
Questions?
Yes.
Well, let's get the mic. Yeah.
So if Darwin had realized he was wrong about considering mating scheme, then he would have gotten the correct answer, right?
Yes, he would have been on his way to doing that, because
Right.
actually, if you believe the Dusing-Fisher model,
Yeah.
mating scheme is irrelevant to it.
Right. So if he realized that, and he would think, okay, now I should consider average number of kids, then he should have gotten the correct answer. But why he actually retracted his theory?
Yeah, good
Without
question.
putting forward the new
Yes, also another thing that's, I admit is a kind of challenge. What I'm saying is, if he had either of those two explanations, he could have just said it the way he gave the examples that I described here. He doesn't draw back from using examples to make a kind of critical point about how don't be misled by this kind of hypothesis because of thus and so. So yeah, it is puzzling. It might be relevant that he was rushing to get the second edition out the door. So you know what it's like, right? Deadlines. Yeah.
Is there evidence that Fisher read Dusey, and where do you think this leaves Fisher? Because he did have some other additions to sex ratio.
Would you repeat the question?
So the question is, did Fisher read Dusing, and
Where do you think this leaves Fisher? 'Cause he did have some other-
so Anthony Edwards is Fisher's last student, and he's written an article about the historiography here. And he said that Dusing's work was common knowledge in the world of biology that Fisher was writing in, and that's why he didn't bother to give him a footnote. I mean, we should recognize that for both Paley and Fisher, the sort of standards of citation that we kind of expect of people, it's like the history of writing is really not like that. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Well, the second part was Fisher had quite a few additions that go beyond this. Would you not agree?
You mean sort of after the 1930 volume?
Well, I mean about like mortality during the period of parental care
Right.
matters for the sex rate, for the primary sex ratio, whereas mortality afterward does not, and so on.
Right. Yeah, that the idea of parental investment was that was what was new in Fisher. There's the Dusing thing, but then parental investment being the right thing. That's what gets equalized. You invest equally in the two sexes. That was a new thing. But as far, I haven't looked at the Variorum edition of Fisher's 1930 book, which has all the additions in it, of course, to see whether he actually supplements it. But I think he didn't. But I should go back and check that. Yeah.
Just for context, is it right to say that Darwin had no idea how sex was determined? I.e., because he hadn't read Mendel,
Yeah, well, he certainly hadn't
know
read-
about environmental
he
sex
had not.
determination.
He had not read Mendel. Yeah, he didn't know. So, I mean, the idea that there's a chromosomal explanation of the sex ratio, by meiosis or something, no, that wasn't an option that he could consider.
I'm just wondering if, in the context of the phylogenetic argument that you're making about how Darwin might have interpreted sex ratio, did he have access to information about sex ratios and in non-human primates that are close relatives of human beings? Was that part of his consideration, or was that not really a factor?
Let me get that slide up. I think.
Oh wait, I missed it. Yeah.
No, where are we? Well, here you go. He thinks that you have monogamy and polygyny in these primates.
Other questions? All right. Well, thanks very much. That was great.